The auditorium was packed, but not with the kind of energy you hope for. Instead of excitement buzzing in the air, the room felt heavy and stagnant. It had been a very long day. The overhead stage lights blazed down relentlessly, turning the air into a thick, suffocating heat that smelled faintly of dust and old velvet. Hundreds of people filled the seats, but their attention was drifting. People were checking their watches, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, or staring blankly at their phones. The magic of the show had worn off hours ago, replaced by a collective desire for it to just be over. Sitting at the long table in the center of the room were the judges. They looked exhausted. The man in the middle sat slumped in his chair, his tie loosened and his pen tapping a bored rhythm against the table. He had seen so many mediocre performances that day that he had stopped hoping for something good. He just wanted to get through the next person and go home. The woman sitting next to him was no better. She was rubbing her temples, her eyes half closed as if she was fighting off a headache. The skepticism was practically radiating off them. They were ready to write off anyone who walked onto that stage before they even opened their mouth. Then the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, calling out the next name. A hush fell over the crowd, but it wasn't a hush of anticipation. It was the polite silence people give when they expect to be disappointed. The side curtain parted, and a young woman stepped out. She didn't look like a star. In fact, she looked like she had just walked in off the street by mistake. She was wearing a simple, faded dress that didn't quite fit right, and plain shoes that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she clutched her hands together in front of her chest as if she were holding on to a lifeline. She didn't stride out with confidence. She shuffled, her eyes wide and darting nervously around the massive room. As soon as she stepped into the spotlight, you could feel the mood in the room shift. It wasn't a good shift. A ripple of whispers moved through the audience like a wave. People leaned toward each other, murmuring behind their hands. You could almost hear the thoughts running through everyone's minds. Is she serious? She looks terrified. What is she doing here? There was a cruel reality to the entertainment world, and it was on full display in that room. In a world obsessed with image, this young woman, with her ordinary clothes and trembling posture, didn't fit the mold. The judges didn't even bother to pick up their pens. The man in the middle let out a barely audible sigh and adjusted his glasses, looking at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance. He had already decided she wasn't worth his time. He had seen this hundreds of times, people who dreamed big but didn't have the look or the talent to back it up. The young woman reached the center of the stage. The lights were blinding her, making it impossible to see the faces of the judges or the crowd. All she could see was a dark void stretching out in front of her, filled with invisible eyes that she could feel boring into her skin. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking in the microphone that stood before her. She looked small up there, isolated and vulnerable against the backdrop of the grand theater. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched out, awkward and heavy. The audience began to grow restless. A few people coughed. Someone in the back row let out a loud, exaggerated yawn. The pressure in the room was mounting, and it was all pressing down on her. She looked like she wanted to run. Her knees were shaking slightly, visible even from a distance. It was painful to watch, like witnessing a car crash in slow motion. The judge in the middle finally broke the silence. He didn't speak with encouragement. His voice was flat and tired. "Name?" he asked, not even looking up at the table. He sounded like a bureaucrat stamping forms at a DMV, not a judge on a talent show. She leaned into the microphone, her voice coming out small and shaky. She told them her name, stumbling over the words. "Age?" the judge asked, still not looking at her. 19, she whispered. The judge finally looked up. He scanned her from head to toe, his expression unimpressed. He didn't see a person with feelings or a story. He saw another waste of 5 minutes. The woman judge next to him didn't even look up. She just stared at the paperwork in front of her, her face blank. The atmosphere was toxic. It was a place where dreams went to die, fueled by cynicism and exhaustion. The audience had already judged her. To them, she was a joke, a comedic relief before the commercial break. They were waiting for her to mess up, waiting for the awkward moment they could laugh about later. The air was so thick with judgment it felt hard to breathe. She stood there, alone on that massive stage, realizing that the entire room was against her. They didn't know her. They didn't know her life, her struggles, or why she was standing there. All they saw was what was on the surface, and they had already decided it wasn't enough. The man in the middle leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, his body language screaming, "Get it over with." She took a deep, shaky breath. She looked down at her shoes for a second, then back up into the terrifying darkness of the audience. She knew what they were thinking. She could feel the ridicule hanging in the air. But she didn't leave. She gripped the microphone stand with both hands to steady herself. She closed her eyes for a brief second, shutting out the lights, the judges, and the whispers. She was just a girl with a simple dream in a room full of people who didn't believe in her. The tension was at its breaking point. The audience was waiting for her to speak, to sing, or to fail. She was the underdog in the truest sense of the word, standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump.
The silence that filled the auditorium was heavy, pressing down on the young woman like a physical weight. The bright spotlight was still blinding her, making the judges and the audience nothing more than dark shapes in the distance. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs so hard that she wondered if the sound was carrying through the microphone. She felt small, insignificant, and painfully exposed. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to turn around and run back through the curtain, to get back to the safety of her quiet life where no one stared at her. The judge in the middle shifted in his chair, the leather squeaking loudly in the quiet room. He looked at her over the rim of his glasses, his expression unimpressed and impatient. He wasn't looking at a person with a dream. He was looking at a nuisance keeping him from his dinner. "Okay," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "So, tell us, what are you going to sing for us today?" The question hung in the air. The young woman took a shaky breath, her hands gripping the microphone stand until her knuckles turned white. She knew that the song she had chosen wasn't flashy. It wasn't the kind of song that people usually use to show off high notes or fast runs. It was an old classic, a simple ballad that her grandmother used to hum to her when she was a little girl. It was a song that told a story, but in a room like this, simplicity was often mistaken for a lack of talent. I'm going to sing "The Old River," she managed to say. Her voice was quiet, barely a whisper, and it trembled with nerves. She immediately regretted choosing it. She knew they wanted something modern, something loud, something that fit the shiny stage, but it was the only song that felt true to her in that moment. The judge in the middle raised an eyebrow. He let out a short, dry laugh that echoed through the hall, causing a few ripples of laughter from the audience. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the sound of someone mocking a foolish idea. "The Old River?" he repeated, shaking his head slowly. "Really? That's a bold choice." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and stared her down. The skepticism was rolling off him in waves. He was testing her. He wanted to see if she would break. "That is a very difficult song to sing," he said, his tone patronizing. "It requires a lot of control, a lot of emotion. Most professionals struggle with it. Are you sure you don't want to sing something simpler? Maybe a pop song? Something we can dance to?" The audience murmured in agreement. They thought he was being kind, giving her an easy way out. They thought he was saving her from embarrassment. But to the young woman on the stage, it felt like an insult. It felt like he was telling her she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong in the same room as real singers. He was judging her by her worn-out dress and her shaking hands, assuming she couldn't possibly have the talent to back up such a demanding choice. The woman judge next to him finally looked up from her paperwork. She glanced at the girl, then at her colleague, and offered a weak, pitying smile. "It is a very big song, sweetie. There's no shame in picking something easier. We just want to hear your voice." The young woman felt a flash of heat in her cheeks. She wanted to disappear, but at the same time, a tiny spark of defiance lit up inside her chest. These people didn't know her. They didn't know the hours she had spent practicing in her bedroom with the door shut. They didn't know how many times she had sung this exact song while cleaning houses or taking care of her family. They saw a scared girl, but inside she was a fighter. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand up just a little bit straighter than she felt. She pulled her shoulders back, trying to look taller than she felt. "No," she said, her voice gaining a tiny bit of strength. "I want to sing this one, please." The judge in the middle sighed loudly and leaned back in his chair, throwing his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "All right," he said, looking at the other judges. "She wants to sing it. Let her sing it." He turned his gaze back to her, his eyes cold. "But don't say we didn't warn you. The music starts when you're ready. Don't waste our time." The pressure in the room was immense. The audience had stopped laughing. Now they were just waiting, many of them already preparing to cringe. They were expecting a disaster. They wanted to see her fail so they could shake their heads and say, "I told you so." It was the cruel nature of the crowd. They loved to see the mighty fall, but they also loved to see the weak stay weak. The young woman looked toward the side of the stage, where the sound engineer and the musicians were waiting. The pianist, an older man with gray hair, was watching her closely. He didn't look bored like the judges. He looked curious. He had seen hundreds of auditions, and he had learned that sometimes the quietest people had the loudest souls. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "Whenever you are ready." She nodded back to him. It was a tiny connection, but it gave her an anchor in the storm. She closed her eyes for a moment to block out the harsh lights and the hundreds of staring eyes. She tried to imagine she was back in her kitchen, safe and warm. She thought about why she picked this song. It wasn't about showing off. It was about the feeling in the words, the pain, the hope, the flow of time. She had to make them feel it too. If she just sang the notes, they would eat her alive. She had to pour her heart out onto that stage, even if it terrified her. The room was deadly silent. The air conditioning hummed quietly, the only sound in the vast space. The judge tapped his pen one last time, a signal of his impatience. She opened her eyes. She looked straight ahead into the darkness, not at the judges, but past them. She lifted one hand slightly, signaling the musician. The pianist's fingers hovered over the keys for a split second before pressing down. The first chord rang out, clear and melancholy. It was a simple sound, but it seemed to cut through the tension in the air like a knife. The audience shifted in their seats. The judge stopped tapping his pen. The young woman stood there, the microphone stand her only support, and took one final deep breath. The challenge had been issued, and she had accepted it. There was no turning back now. She was about to show them that you should never judge a book by its cover, no matter how plain the cover might be.
The soft, melancholic notes from the piano drifted through the vast room, wrapping around the audience like a thin mist. It was a gentle sound, quiet and controlled, but it seemed to command attention simply because it was so different from the noise and chaos of the previous auditions. The young woman stood perfectly still in the center of the spotlight. Her eyes were closed, her long lashes resting on her cheeks, and her hands were no longer white-knuckled on the microphone stand. Instead, they rested gently on the metal bar. For a moment, she didn't sing. She just let the music wash over her, letting the rhythm settle into her bones. You could see her chest rise and fall with a deep, calming breath. When she finally opened her mouth to sing, the sound that came out was soft and fragile, like a small bird testing its wings for the first time. It wasn't loud or booming. It was just a clear, pure note that hung in the air. "Down by the water, where the willows weep," she sang. Her voice was steady, but it was small. It didn't fill the massive hall. It sounded like she was singing to herself, or perhaps to one person standing right in front of her, rather than to 1,000 strangers. In the first few rows, people shifted in their seats. They were listening, but they weren't impressed. It was the kind of polite attention you give someone when they are speaking, even if you aren't really interested. To the untrained ear, it sounded nice enough. She was definitely in tune, which was more than could be said for the last few acts, but it didn't seem special. It sounded like a lullaby. It sounded like something you would hear in a church choir on a quiet Sunday, not the kind of voice that wins a national competition. The judge in the middle kept his head down. He was scribbling something on his clipboard, his hand moving quickly. He didn't even look up at the stage. He had already categorized her in his mind, the choir girl. Pleasant, harmless, but boring. He was probably writing notes about how she lacked stage presence, or how her tone was too breathy. He was just waiting for the song to end so he could give her a generic "good job" and send her on her way. The woman judge next to him had stopped rubbing her temples, but she still looked unimpressed. She was looking at the young woman with a critical eye, analyzing her posture, her dress, her stillness. In her mind, she was thinking that this girl didn't know how to perform. She was just standing there. Where was the movement? Where was the energy? It felt too passive, too weak. The audience was restless too. A few people near the back whispered to each other. One man checked his phone, brightening his face with a blue light for a second before he quickly put it away. They were waiting for the crash. Experience had taught them that when someone starts off this softly and simply, they usually can't handle the big parts of the song later. They were holding their breath, not because they were moved, but because they were waiting for her voice to crack, to go off key, or to run out of breath. They were preparing to wince. But up on the stage, the young woman didn't notice any of this. She had entered her own world. As she sang the second line of the verse, her shoulders dropped another inch. She was letting go of the fear. The trembling in her hands had stopped completely. She wasn't thinking about the judges or the audience anymore. She was thinking about the story in the song. She was thinking about the river flowing endlessly, about the passage of time, about the feeling of being small in a big world. That was a feeling she knew well. She had spent her whole life feeling small, feeling overlooked, like a pebble on the bank while the river of life rushed past everyone else. She poured that feeling into her voice. It wasn't a technical performance anymore. It was becoming a confession. As she moved through the first verse, her voice began to grow stronger. It wasn't a sudden change. It was a slow, steady build, like the sun rising over the horizon. The breathiness faded, replaced by a richer, warmer tone. She started to use more of her diaphragm, projecting the sound outwards without forcing it. The notes became clearer, more resonant. The pianist noticed the change first. He had been playing mechanically, just doing his job, but he glanced up at her in surprise. He felt the shift in her energy. She wasn't just reciting lyrics, she was living them. He adjusted his playing slightly, adding a little more depth to support her, matching her growing intensity. A few people in the audience stopped whispering. They looked up, their eyes focusing on the stage. There was something happening in her voice that was starting to catch them off guard. It was a quality that you couldn't quite put your finger on, a texture, an emotion. She sang a phrase about waiting for a ship that never comes, and her voice dipped low, carrying a heaviness that made a chill run down the spines of the listeners. It sounded real. It didn't sound like she was pretending to be sad. It sounded like she knew exactly what heartbreak felt like. The judge in the middle stopped writing. His pen hovered over the paper. He frowned slightly, distracted by a sound that was cutting through his focus. It was her voice. It was changing. It was getting bigger. He looked up, squinting against the bright lights to see her face. She still looked ordinary. She hadn't moved a muscle. She was just standing there, eyes closed, pouring her heart out. But the sound hitting his ears was no longer just nice. It was controlled. It was professional. and it was starting to fill the room. He sat up a little straighter in his chair, the cynicism on his face cracked just a fraction. He realized he might have made a mistake. The woman judge next to him noticed his movement and turned her gaze back to the stage. She tilted her head to the side, listening more closely now. Her arms uncrossed and fell into her lap. The young woman was approaching the end of the verse. She sang the last line softly, letting the note fade into silence for a heartbeat. The room was completely still. No one coughed. No one moved. The anticipation was different now. They weren't waiting for her to fail anymore. They were waiting to see what she would do next. They were confused, intrigued, and strangely captivated. She took a breath that seemed to last forever. She was about to hit the chorus. This was the moment that most amateurs fell apart, the moment where they had to jump up in volume and power. The judges leaned in, the audience leaned in. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. She closed her eyes tighter, digging deep inside herself to find the strength she needed. She wasn't just singing a song anymore. She was fighting for her place on that stage, and she was just about to show them exactly what she was made of.
The silence that hung over the auditorium shattered the moment she opened her mouth to sing the chorus. It wasn't a gradual build or a slow climb. It was an explosion of sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul, a place she had kept locked away for her entire life. The fragile, breathy girl from the verse vanished instantly, replaced by a powerhouse of a woman who commanded the stage without moving a single muscle. "And the river flows, carrying my pain away," she belted out. The sound was so rich, so full, and so incredibly loud that it physically knocked the air out of the room. It wasn't shouting, it was pure, resonant singing that seemed to bounce off the back walls and shake the dust from the rafters. The note hung in the air, steady and strong, vibrating with a raw intensity that made the hairs on people's arms stand up straight. The reaction was immediate and visceral, starting from the front and spreading to the back like a ripple in a pond. The judge in the middle, the one who had been so bored and cynical, actually jumped in his seat. His hand froze halfway to his glass of water. He stared at the stage, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide behind his glasses. The pen he had been holding slipped from his fingers and fell onto the table with a soft clatter, but he didn't even hear it. He forgot all about his dinner, his headache, and his boredom. In a single second, his choir girl theory had been completely obliterated. The woman judge next to him sat bolt upright. The look of pity on her face vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. She turned her head sharply to look at her colleague, her eyes asking, "Did you hear that?" She wasn't analyzing the technique anymore. She was just feeling it. The power in the young woman's voice was hitting them like a physical force. In the audience, the change was even more dramatic. The man who had been checking his phone stopped dead. He slowly lowered his hand, his eyes glued to the stage, the phone forgotten in his lap. The whispers died instantly. No one was coughing, no one was shifting in their seats. Hundreds of people were suddenly struck dumb by the realization that they had been completely wrong. The atmosphere shifted from mockery to awe in the blink of an eye. It wasn't just that she could sing loud, it was the quality of the voice. It had a grit to it, a texture of sadness and strength that you couldn't learn in a singing class. It sounded like a life lived, like a voice that had seen hard times and survived. She was singing an old, simple song, but she was making it sound brand new. She was pouring every ounce of her nervousness, her fear, and her frustration into those notes, transforming them into something beautiful and terrifying. She stood there in her plain dress, her eyes squeezed shut, her face contorted with the effort of pouring out so much emotion. She wasn't posing. She wasn't trying to look pretty for the cameras. She was letting the music use her as a vessel. The contrast was startling. This small, plain girl standing alone on a massive stage, producing a sound that seemed big enough to fill a stadium. It was the kind of moment that gives you chills, the kind of moment you'd tell your friends about later saying, "You had to be there."
The pianist was smiling now, his fingers flying over the keys with renewed energy. He was no longer just accompanying her, he was following her lead. He was adding flourishes and emphasis that he hadn't planned, feeding off the incredible energy she was radiating. They were locked in, connected by the music, creating a moment that was greater than the sum of its parts. As she hit the high note at the peak of the chorus, a note that most professional singers would struggle to hit, she held it effortlessly. It didn't waver, it didn't crack, it soared. The sound seemed to pierce through the cynicism of the judges and the indifference of the crowd, touching something human in everyone there. It was a reminder that talent doesn't have a specific look. It doesn't wear expensive clothes. It doesn't walk with confidence. Sometimes talent looks exactly like her, standing in the spotlight, shaking with fear, but singing like an angel. The judge in the middle ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head in amazement. He looked down at his clipboard, at the notes he had written, and felt a wave of guilt. He had judged a book by its cover, and he had been wrong. He realized that this wasn't just a good audition. This was a rare, once-in-a-lifetime talent. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands, completely captivated. He didn't want to miss a single second of it. The audience was holding its breath collectively. It felt like the entire room had been lifted up. The air crackled with electricity. People were looking at each other with wide eyes, mouthing the words, "Wow," or "Oh my God." The arrogance was gone. The boredom was gone. Everyone was equal in that moment, united by the unexpected beauty of what they were hearing. They were witnessing a star being born right in front of their eyes, in the most unlikely package imaginable. She transitioned into the second verse, dropping the volume back down, but keeping the intensity high. The contrast was just as powerful as the volume. She proved she didn't need to be loud to be heard. The control she had was masterful. She could whisper and make the front row lean in, then roar and make the back row gasp. She was playing the room like an instrument, and she didn't even know she was doing it. The song was building towards its finale. The emotion was swelling, the piano was rising, and her voice was growing stronger with every word. The young woman was no longer the scared girl who walked out from behind the curtain. She was a force of nature. The judges were on the edge of their seats, their pencils down, their attention 100% fixed on her. They knew they were about to see the end of the song, but they didn't want it to end. They wanted to stay in this moment where the world had stopped and only the music mattered. The unexpected had arrived, and it was absolutely breathtaking.
The song was racing towards its end, the piano playing faster and louder, building a wall of sound that seemed to push against the walls of the auditorium. The young woman was no longer just standing there. She was leaning forward, pouring every single ounce of energy she had left into the performance. Her eyes were squeezed tight, her neck muscles tight with exertion, and her hands were gripping the microphone stand like it was the only thing keeping her on the ground. She reached the final line, the most important line of the entire song. It was a note that required her to jump up the scale and hold it, long and steady, letting it fade out slowly. She took a massive breath, filling her lungs completely, and then she let it go. "And I will sing," she cried out, her voice cracking with emotion, before smoothing out into a crystal-clear, powerful tone that seemed to suspend time itself. She held the note. It didn't waver. It didn't shake. It was perfect. The pianist played his final chord, a deep, resonant sound that rumbled through the floorboards, and then he lifted his hands off the keys. The young woman held the last note for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, until the sound began to naturally fade into the silence of the room. As the last whisper of sound disappeared, she dropped her shoulders and let out a soft breath, opening her eyes. For a heartbeat, the entire world was silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. No one moved, no one breathed. The audience sat frozen, staring at the stage. The judge in the middle was still leaning forward, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide. The woman next to him had a hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes glistening with sudden tears. They were all processing what they had just heard. It was as if their brains needed a moment to catch up with their hearts. The contrast between the girl they saw and the voice they heard was too great to understand instantly. Then, a single person in the back row began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap. Then another person joined in, then another. Within seconds, the silence broke. The sound started as a ripple and then turned into a massive, deafening wave. The audience erupted. It wasn't just polite applause, it was a roar. 500 people leaped to their feet at the exact same time. The sound was so loud it seemed to shake the dust from the ceiling lights. "Wow! Incredible!" someone shouted from the balcony. "Bravo!" screamed another voice. The young woman stood there, blinking rapidly, completely stunned. She looked out at the crowd, but for a moment she couldn't see them clearly because the spotlight was too bright. All she could see was a blur of standing figures and the flash of hundreds of cameras going off like fireflies. She couldn't believe her ears. She had expected a few polite claps, maybe a nod from the judges, but this was something else entirely. The cynical judge in the middle sat there for a moment, looking down at his table. He shook his head slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. He felt a lump forming in his throat, a rare occurrence for him. He realized that in all his years of doing this job, he had become hardened. He had stopped seeing the people and started only seeing the product. But today, this simple girl with the big voice had reminded him why he loved music in the first place. It wasn't about the image or the marketing, it was about the raw human connection. He stood up, smoothing his jacket, and began to clap. The woman next to him stood up immediately, wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, applauding enthusiastically. Soon, all 3 judges were on their feet, giving her a standing ovation. This was the ultimate seal of approval, something that very few contestants ever received. The noise in the room was overwhelming. It was a chaotic mix of cheering, whistling, and stomping feet. The air, which had been so thick with boredom and judgment earlier, was now electric with excitement and joy. The energy had flipped completely. The girl who had walked out as a joke to the audience was now the queen of the stage. The pianist, beaming with pride, gave her a thumbs up from behind his piano. The young woman looked at the judges, who were now smiling at her warmly. The skepticism was gone. The boredom had vanished. In its place was respect. She saw the judge in the middle nodding at her, a genuine look of admiration in his eyes. He was acknowledging that he had been wrong. He was telling her, without saying a word, that she belonged there. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by a rush of pure happiness. Her knees felt weak, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the adrenaline of the moment. She brought her hands up to her face and covered her mouth, letting out a small, shy laugh. It was a humble gesture, one that made the audience love her even more. They saw that she wasn't arrogant. She was just a normal person who had done something extraordinary. The announcer's voice cut through the noise, trying to calm the crowd down, but they wouldn't stop. They kept clapping and cheering for another 2 full minutes. It was one of those rare moments in live television where the schedule didn't matter anymore. The producers in the control room were jumping with excitement, knowing they had struck gold. They hadn't found a polished pop star. They had found a diamond in the rough. Finally, the applause began to die down just enough for the judge in the middle to speak. He leaned into his microphone, looking at her with a serious expression. "I have been doing this for a long time," he said, his voice echoing through the quieting room. "And I have to admit, I made a mistake. When you walked out, I judged you. I looked at how you were dressed, I saw how nervous you were, and I thought I knew what was coming. I was wrong." He paused, looking out at the audience, then back at her. "That was one of the most beautiful, honest, and powerful performances I have ever heard. You asked to sing a simple tune, but you gave us something unexpected. You gave us magic." The audience erupted again, but this time the young woman didn't look startled.
She smiled a huge, genuine smile that lit up her face. She bowed deeply, holding her dress and curtsying slightly, a gesture of old-fashioned grace. When she straightened up, her eyes were shining with light, not just with tears, but with the light of a dream coming true. She had walked onto that stage feeling like she wasn't good enough, feeling like the whole world was against her, but she had proven them all wrong. She had shown them that talent doesn't care about what you wear or how you look. It comes from inside. And as she stood there, bathed in the spotlight and the love of the crowd, she finally felt like she was home. She had delivered the unexpected, and her life would never be the same again.